So we've got these last 2 weeks on Rorty, and today I want to introduce what I see as the final stage in the development of his thought that is initiated with the 1996 Girona lectures he gave, which was 10 lectures. One of the things I've sent to you, and of course is also on the website, is the list of those lectures. Though he cannibalized these lectures for and published bits of them elsewhere, he planned a book containing these 10 lectures, and it was actually published in Catalan and in Spanish, but never in English. And since I believe that this was the official announcement and formulation of a new set of anti-representationalist arguments, anti-authoritarian, anti-representationalist arguments, broadly political ones, we've been agitating to get these lectures published, and Harvard Press has agreed now. And so in the next year, these should come out officially, edited by Eduardo Mendieta, who's a Rorty scholar, inter alia. So mostly I want to talk about this anti-representationalist arguments from anti-authoritarianism, Rorty's redescription of his pragmatism as completing the work of enlightenment. And I've written about this argument in a couple of lectures, which is what I'd like us to read and talk about next week. But I'd like to introduce the ideas this week by putting them in the context of what I see as a battery of anti-representationalist arguments. It's a striking thing, I think, that throughout his philosophical career, Rorty took representationalism, the idea of representation, as his target. He never seems to have wavered in that. This was his diagnosis of where modern philosophy went wrong. In some sense, it plays the role in his thought that alienation plays in Hegel's thought. Saw modernity as a good thing, as a progressive movement, but thought that it had this, that shiny apple had a worm in it, that Hegel called alienation. Rorty sees understanding discursive practice as having as its principal aim representing how things objectively are as the great bad in modern philosophy. And though his arguments against it, his diagnosis of just where it went wrong, evolved substantially, that's mostly what I want to talk about today, it's striking that he never wavered in thinking that was the great bad. And his constructive philosophical views, the pragmatism that he recommended as an alternative, is an attempt to see the world philosophically without using the concept of representation, without endorsing it. Now, we've talked about the first version of this argument in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, where he traces back the oscillation between skepticism and foundationalism in Enlightenment epistemology, and since then, to the underlying representationalism. And we pointed out that he became dissatisfied with this, partly for historical / sociological reasons, people by the late 70s were not typically foundationalists, were not fussed about skepticism, and yet they were still representationalists. So it seemed that you could be a representationalist without being a foundationalist. And partly, I think, on low pragmatic grounds, that the argument in PMN had not convinced people, had not engendered a wave of criticism of representationalism or an effort to try and do without it. So we've been looking at one of the responses that Rorty had to this, what I called his literary turn, using Quine's arguments in Two Dogmas as elaborated and developed by Davidson, to reject the language theory distinction, the meaning belief distinction, introduce the vocabulary, and with the thought that the vocabulary undercut what I've called the Kantian problematic of assigning some features of our discourse, dividing features of our discourse into those that are as they are because of the way the world we're talking about is, on the one hand, and features of our discourse that are the way they are because of contingent features of us discursive practitioners, our embodiment, the history of our practices, and so on. And his thought was that undercutting that, the presuppositions of that Kantian problematic shows that we shouldn't think of what we're doing as representing the way the world is. But he was never clear how to connect, the good reasons, I think, the good pragmatist reasons that Quine and Davidson had advanced for using the vocabulary. It was never clear just how the argument from that to an anti-representationalist conclusion evolved. And I want to talk about some of the things that he tried out as I understand it here. But in the last decade of his life, as I say, these lectures were in '96, he died in 2007. In the last decade of his life, he tried out a new set of arguments, not inspired by the literary theorists, but appealing to broadly political anti-authoritarian principles. So I'd like to look more closely at a battery of arguments that some of which flower in the anti-authoritarianism arguments, others of which seem to be in the air, but it's not clear whether he still endorses them. Misak mentioned that in the wake of the publication of Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, which really did make a big splash, Rorty left academic philosophy, at least in moving over to literary departments. And there's one thing she said that I wanted to contest, I guess. This would be on the handout from now 2 weeks ago, I think. Misak said, many of Rorty's followers still believe that to have been his student or to work on pragmatist topics is to put oneself at risk of failure in the academic job market. In the preface to his volume in the Library of Living Philosophers, which Rorty saw to completion in the final days of his life, Randy Auxier says, Rorty prudently exiled himself from professional philosophy so as not to damage the careers of those who wanted to study with him. Now, I think it may well be true that Rorty was worried about that, but I just wanted to register that it didn't in any way happen. Probably Rorty's two most prominent students were me and Cornell West, neither of whom would say that our careers were crippled by our association with Rorty. Rorty had very few students at Princeton, but Mike Williams, who has a distinguished appointment at Johns Hopkins, and Barry Allen, who's made his career in Vancouver. Everybody did just fine. There was no backlash, and indeed, Rorty was a wonderful shepherd of the handful of students that he did have. And I'm minded just to detour slightly to tell one of my favorite German academic anecdotes in this connection. It's a story that the Germans tell to explain to everybody sort of how things work. And it dates itself by its technology. So let me just tell the story before we get to the serious argumentation. And this starts off with a sparrow flying around in the woods, and he sees a little rabbit in a clearing typing away like crazy on a typewriter, tap, tap, tap. And the sparrow is surprised by this, flies around to see what's happening, and realizes that unbeknownst to the rabbit, there's a wolf creeping up on him. And the wolf finally confronts him and says, "Little rabbit, I'm going to eat you." And the rabbit says, "No, no, no, tap, tap, tap," doesn't stop typing. He says, "You can't, this is too important. I'm working on my Doktorarbeit, on my dissertation. And it's very important." And the wolf says, "Well, what could be so important that I shouldn't eat you? What is the title of your Doktorarbeit anyway?" And he says, "Oh, it's how a rabbit can beat a wolf." And the wolf said, "Well, that can't be that important. I'm about to eat you." And the rabbit says, "Well, just a second, let me finish this sentence." "Yeah, okay, here, come with me and I'll show you." And he takes him over. There's a cave entrance, and the sparrow flies over the two. The rabbit and the wolf go in, and there's a huge commotion in there. And after a few minutes, the rabbit comes out brushing himself off, and goes back and is typing away. The sparrow thinks this is very interesting. But the rabbit is so involved in what he's doing that he doesn't notice a bear who comes up and says, "Little rabbit, I'm going to eat you." "No, no, my important Doktorarbeit, you can't eat me." "Well, why is it important? What's the title of this work anyway?" He says, "Oh, it's how a rabbit can beat a bear." He says, "Well, that's silly. I'm huge, you're little, I'm going to eat you." "Well, just let me finish this sentence and I'll show you." Takes him over to the cave. They both go in, huge commotion. After a while, the rabbit comes out, sits down again to work, and the sparrow flies around and says, "Well, this is very impressive, little rabbit, but what is the title of your Doktorarbeit? You said two different things." And the rabbit says, "So you don't understand, do you?" He said, "Come on over to the cave, I'll show you." The sparrow said, "Oh, maybe I don't want to go over there." "No, no, that's just for wolves and bears, you'll be fine." He goes into the cave, and when his eyes adjust, he sees a huge pile of meat and bones thrown everywhere, and sitting in the middle of it, a magnificent lion who is gnawing on the bones of the bear and the wolf. And the rabbit says, "So now you understand." Sparrow says, "No, I don't think I do." So, well, the moral of the story is, it's not at all important in the end what the title of your Doktorarbeit is. What matters is who your Doktorvater is. Well, this is to explain the function of people in this academic environment, Rorty was a magnificent lion, Dr. Vater, and should not have been concerned about this. Okay, that's enough for the silliness. In the piece called An Arc of Thought, which I think was on the syllabus for one of the earlier weeks, but I didn't talk about it. You may not have paid much attention to it. I describe a train of thought that I see leading Rorty to pragmatism independently of the argument in philosophy and the mirror of nature, but happening around the same time. Rorty made his career with the first new response to the mind-body problem that anybody had had in at least a generation, his eliminative materialism that he articulated in a series of articles in the late 60s. The best known, and I think most important of them, is incorrigibility as the mark of the mental. There he's asking himself the question, why isn't the mind-body problem ancient? That was the title of an essay by Wallace Matson. And he says, well, it wasn't because Descartes redescribed the mind in response to the burgeoning new science, redescribed it in epistemic terms, drew the boundary on the basis of, around the mental, on the basis of incorrigibility, the impossibility of making a mistake, and so assimilated what Aristotle and his scholastic successors never would have assimilated, conceptually articulated thoughts that the Cathedral of Learning is 555 feet tall, that thought with raw feels and sensations, with a red after image or the sensation of pain. Those were completely different things in the Aristotelian hierarchy, but Descartes assimilated them under the heading of incorrigibility. And Rorty then asks, well, what social practices are associated with incorrigible reports of these mental happenings? He says, well, the key thing is that sincere first-person contemporaneous reports of mental events are unoverridable. They have this distinctive social feature that nothing anybody else says can count as contradicting your report, as overriding it, as showing that what you have said is wrong. If you say, well, I'm now thinking about the height of the Cathedral of Learning, or I'm now feeling a sharp pain in my neck, our social practices are such that you have the final authority over that. There's no overriding that. And Rorty's eliminative materialism was the thought, well, that's a normative status, a kind of authority, incorrigibility, that is a matter of the role in our social practices that these reports play. And we could change that. We could decide that on Freudian grounds, there were other considerations that could override your reports of what you were thinking or what you were believing. Or we could get cerebroscopes that say, no, you're wrong. You say that was a red after image you had, but we can see here it was actually an orange one, and you were hasty in your specification of it. Eliminative materialism was saying, we brought Cartesian minds into existence by adopting these social practices. We really do have Cartesian minds now, insofar as our practices accord these reports incorrigibility, but we could change our practices, and then there would be no Cartesian minds. And this was eliminative materialism. And the lesson I think he learned from this, it was important to him to claim it's not as though there were some feature of the world, Cartesian mental events, which before we had practices of according these reports incorrigibility, that normative status, that unoverridable authority, we simply hadn't noticed. We're not talking about, we're not representing. And Descartes got us to acknowledge them, to recognize them, to report them, to be aware of them as such. And which features of the world, were we to change our practices so that we no longer accorded these reports unoverridable authority, we would simply have stopped talking about that bit of the furniture of the world. He says, no, to say that there are these things and to say that we have practices with this distinctive feature, that's two ways of saying the same thing. There were no Cartesian minds before we had these practices, and there would be no Cartesian minds if we altered those practices. Now, I think that this line of thought that Rorty already had by 1970 was actually behind his pragmatism in the following way. He thought of social things as being like Cartesian subjective mental things, except where Cartesian mental things were picked out by the unique unoverridable authority that individual subjects have over their mental events, the subjective goings on in this sense. Social things, social practices, were things that the community had this sort of authority over. So what's the appropriate greeting gesture in some tribe is entirely a matter of what they take or treat in practice as an appropriate greeting gesture. It's not answering to something over and above their practices. Their practical attitudes are completely authoritative about how it's appropriate to greet one another in the Kwakiutl tribe. And objective things on this line of thought are things that no individual subject is authoritative about, and neither is any community. We can understand a sense of objectivity by simply denying the authority of individual subjects or communities over the justification of claims that are, in this sense, objective. And to say that is to say that the distinction between these three kinds of things, between subjective things and, if you like, intersubjective or social things, and objective things, ought to be understood in terms of the authority structures instituted by the social practices of talking, as it were, about them. That to be a subjective thing is for reports to have a certain normative status, namely that the one making the report, the individual, is incorrigible about them. And for something to be a matter of social practice, this is something John Searle would later write about in the social construction of reality. To be a social thing is to be something that the community has unoverridable authority about. And to have the status of making objective claims is, within a community, is for those claims to have, it is for no individual or community to be authoritative about the justification of those claims. And this thought then was that the distinction between these three kinds of things, subjective things, social things, and objective things, objective just in the sense that they're neither subjective nor social, is a social distinction. And that the pragmatist thought was, we'd taken that distinction to be an objective one. But once we can understand that what distinguishes these kinds of things is the normative status of descriptions of them, of reports of them, what the nature of the authority governing those reports is, then we can see that these are all social distinctions. Now, this is an argument that's will be, sort of in the second half of the course, recognizably akin to the distinction that Hugh Price makes between being an object naturalist and being a subject naturalist. It's sort of holding the naturalism in that distinction, or dividing through by the naturalism. Now, this argument, I think, was in the background in Rorty's thinking already in the Consequences of Pragmatism book from 1982. It doesn't come to full flowering, I think, until the Girona authoritarianism arguments. But I think it was in play here. And I would say it was a combination of the idea inspired by his account of incorrigibility as the mark of the Cartesian mental, that the division of things into subjective, social, and one sense of objective anyway, is a normative distinction, a matter of different authority structures for different kinds of claims. The claims that naively are taken to describe different kinds of things. But he's seeing the categorization of the things represented as reflecting normative features of the practices of representing or describing them. And if you combine that view with what I've called social pragmatism about norms, about authority and responsibility, that says that all matters of authority and responsibility are matters of the role that something plays in social practices, then you get a pragmatist view about these fundamental ontological kinds. Rorty talked in terms of authority in the Limited Materialism. I've sort of redescribed that in terms of normativity, which is not talk about norms. That was never part of his vocabulary, though the notion of authority and responsibility loomed large in it. So I would like to see the development of his thought as something like this idea or this line of thought struggling to come to the surface and get articulated. It doesn't loom large in Mirror. I think it's evidently in play in the attempt to leverage the arguments for the vocabulary into an anti-representationalist argument. Let me pause there. This is, I put this in the crudest possible terms because I want to see different versions of this thought as in play at different periods in Rorty's argument, and I want to get it on the table for us to think about in preparation for worrying about prices. Different version of anti-representationalism based on his subject naturalism, object naturalism distinction. Are there comments people would like to make about this line of thought?
I have a quick question. So when you talk about, well, you were careful to say when he's talking about these three kinds of things, the subjective, intersubjective, and the objective, you say some sense of the objective. I just want to be clear, get a better understanding what you meant by that. Is it?
Okay, very good. So this was clearly a privative sense that he's using the category of objective, just throwing everything in there that doesn't have the distinctive authoritative claims about which don't have the distinctive authority structures of the subjective or of the social or intersubjective. Everything else he's calling objective. And you might think that's a pretty weak notion of objectivity, that merely privative notion, and that in particular, the authority structure that's distinctive of objective claims is not just this grab bag. Well, it's not the individual subject or even the whole community that's authoritative. It's that the facts that we're stating are authoritative. The things we're talking about are authoritative, and we're responsible to them for the correctness of our claims, in that they provide a standard for assessment of the correctness of our objective claims in a distinctive sense of correct, the sense of truth that goes with truth rather than justification. And I think the strongest version of the anti-authoritarian argument looks at that much more restricted and sort of stronger notion of objectivity, but still understands it in normative terms. So one way to characterize the development from the loose version of this thought that I would see in play in the Consequences of Pragmatism book to the more powerful version of it that I think at least the best version of the anti-authoritarian arguments has is this one, that he combines it with the thought that at any rate, the way I read Hegel, he reads Kant as having put in play that representation is a normative conception, that to treat something as, or understand something as a representing of something represented, as having that distinctive intentional directedness, being of or about something, is to take it that what counts as represented by it has authority over assessments of the correctness of the representing has a representing of that represented. It serves as a standard for normative assessments of correctness. And in that sense, the representing is responsible for its correctness to what's represented. And if you combine that thought, that representation is a normative conception, with social pragmatism about norms, and say, well, to have any authority or responsibility is a matter of playing a certain role in social practices, then I think you get the most defensible version of Rorty's anti-authoritarian argument against representationalism. So you're right, I was careful to qualify the notion of objectivity that goes with that first inchoate version of the thought as stemming from the limited materialism. Okay, I said that in the period between Mirror and the Girona anti-authoritarian arguments, Rorty was, as I understand, casting about for ways to use the arguments, the good Quinean pragmatist arguments, for using the vocabulary rather than a neo-Kantian vocabulary of meanings or language, which are entirely up to us, and then theories or beliefs, which are settled as true or false by the way what we're talking about is. That version of the Kantian problematic, but that he really didn't know how to do that. And I want to talk about one argument that goes by very fast and that I think Rorty never, I'm not aware of any article where he just tried to articulate this line of thought. But I think it's an interesting one, and it bubbles up in various places. And this is an argument from, in effect, the holism of two dogmas of empiricism, where he argues that we can't pick out sentence-like bits of the world, his way of talking about facts, to make our sentences true one by one. That the whole constellation of our commitments faces the world as a tribunal, as a whole. And that the representationalist picture, at any rate, as it's addressed by this argument, he's objecting to it insofar as it's an atomistic picture, insofar as it sees sentences as made true, sort of one by one, each with its own truth maker. And here, I think we can unpack this argument a little bit and see it to begin with as an argument concerning the contents expressed by our using a vocabulary. So on the side of meaning rather than the world, to begin with, it's supposed to undercut, be an application of the undercutting of that distinction or an articulation of how we might. But I think it's worth thinking about it as proceeding in two phases. One having to do with the contents of our beliefs and claims, and then using the vocabulary saying, well, you can't think about the world as in the representationalist way if you appreciate this holistic feature of the contents of our thoughts, commitments, and claims. So I want to think about it in two parts. First, having to do with the content, and then applying that to how we should think about sort of the world that we're deploying a vocabulary in. And here, the slogan to keep in mind, I think, is that intentional states focus on beliefs are content without vehicles. This talk about them as being vehicleless, that's McDowell's way of articulating this thought. But it's been followed up by a number of other people, and Davidson is the one who is sort of most associated with it. It's usefully thought of as a rejection of Fodor's LOT, language of thought hypothesis. So Fodor's thought was, well, when I believe that things are thus and so, that the Cathedral of Learning is 555 feet tall, there must be something that stands to my belief as the noises that I make when I say the Cathedral of Learning is 555 feet tall, stands to the content I'm expressing there, or the chalk on the board or the ink on the page stands to that claim when I write it down. That is, there must be something that is the sign design, that's Seller's terminology, that is the vehicle expressing that content. And Fodor says, well, we don't know exactly what that is, but it's some brain writing in the language of thought. That just as when I write something with a pen, I make marks, and the marks express the content. So when I have that thought or have that belief, there must be some constellation of electrochemical activity or something that is the vehicle expressing that. And it must be different for different contents. When I think the Cathedral of Learning is so high, that's different from when I think that snow is white. Those are going to be different inscriptions. Well, that's not surprising, perhaps. Fodor thinks there's simply no alternative to this. Any other conception would be magical. McDowell's thought, following Davidson, and I would say the one who has most focused on this feature of Davidson's view is Lynn Rudder Baker, who has a book about belief and the vehiclelessness of belief. And McDowell's student, Pitt student, Sonia Sevi, is someone who has run with this idea in cognitive science, is to claim it's essential to intentional states, to beliefs, that they're vehicleless, that there is nothing that stands to them as the inscription stands to a written expression of a propositional content, or as the noises that we make stand to sayings of them. Now, how could that be? Well, there's two things you could say, and I think my reading of the subsequent literature is that this vehiclelessness claim has two dimensions to it. One of the claims is, well, there isn't any unit smaller than the whole person that is the vehicle of the belief. And here we have Davidson, who, according to whose interpretivist methodology, this is Davidson's most basic idea, that what you believe and what your words mean, which have to be determined together, are whatever the best interpretation of your behavior would take them to be. The interpretation that makes the most sense, that best rationalizes your behavior. It's not that that's just the best grip we've got on what you believe and what you mean. The interpretivist methodology says, no, that's what it is to believe or mean something, is for the best overall interpretation of your behavior, the one that best rationalizes your behavior, to attribute those to you. So we attribute only the whole set of beliefs and meanings, and we attribute all of it to you, and indeed not to just a time slice of you, not to a snapshot of you. This is behind, anyway, it's one of the premises in the Davidson Swamp Man argument, withholding attribution of genuine beliefs to the Swamp Man. So one of the claims of vehiclelessness is there isn't any bearer of your beliefs smaller than the whole person acting over time. A second limb of the vehiclelessness of intentional states argument is that, and this is the one that McDowell has particularly pressed, is that beliefs in principle have no non-intentional specifications. The only way to pick out your belief that things are thus and so is as your belief that things are thus and so. The idea of a vehicle is the idea that you could give a non-intentional, non-semantic specification of that belief by describing the sign design that expresses it. After all, I could do that for the inscription on the board or the noises that I'm making, giving a merely phonological specification of the expression of the belief, and say it's the belief that's expressed by this. But McDowell claims that's a fundamental mistake about intentional states. They only have intentional specifications. Anything, you can only specify them in that vocabulary. And again, would give a broadly Davidsonian interpretivist argument for that. So you'll hear these arguments invoked usually implicitly, and so not very clearly, when people complain about or are suspicious about subpersonal specifications of intentional states. And I'm saying the subpersonal can mean two things. One is that you're attributing or identifying the belief with something smaller than the whole person, with some brain state of them. Or it can mean that you're trying to give a non-intentional, non-semantic specification of the content of the state that is not in terms of its content, but in terms of something else. And any specification that isn't a specification in the vocabulary in which you specify the content, the claim is a specification of something else. Now I realize that's a lot to take in all at once, and we haven't been reading the Davidson. As I can point you to these other references. This is a sort of fork point in philosophy of mind, is whether you think of representations in a Fodorian language of thought sort of way, or think of them in this Davidsonian, McDowellian sort of way, where in principle only the whole person described in the language of giving and asking for reasons, making claims, being committed to things and responsible for them, is attributing beliefs, intentions, desires, and so on to them. Anything anybody wants to say or ask about that line of thought? I mean, I pitched this the way it usually is articulated, as being about our beliefs, about the believings, and about the contents, the believables. You can only specify the believings in terms of vocabulary that specifies the believables, the contents of them. Otherwise, you're picking something else out. And that these intentional states are fundamentally different from written or spoken expressions of those beliefs, precisely in being vehicleless. Now, the argument that I'm seeing as implicit in Rorty, when he's saying you can't pick out sentence-shaped bits of the world that will be truth makers for our beliefs one-on-one, that the whole constellation of our commitments faces the world together. He's wanting to take another step in this vehiclelessness of thought and intentional states, and say, if you think that, and you've made the transition from a neo-Kantian Carnapian language theory, meaning belief distinction, to thinking about vocabularies and the use of a vocabulary as having at once to be instituting the meanings and applying them to make claims. The question here is, if we're going to be holists about belief and meaning, about vocabularies and the contents of the expressions in the vocabularies, don't we have to be holists about what we're talking about the world that vocabulary is deployed in? And here, the rhetoric of Rorty's that I'm thinking about as sort of taking this next step, when he's saying, look, it doesn't in the end make sense to think about the world as coming in sentence-shaped facts that are truth makers one by one for our sentences. You say, well, what vocabulary would those sentence-shaped truth makers be in? Those facts. And here, it seems like there's only two options. Either it's nature's own vocabulary, remember that phrase of Rorty's, or it's the vocabulary in which we state the claim, and it's one of our vocabularies. Frege doesn't think the world consists of facts. He says a fact is a thought that is true, meaning by a thought a thinkable rather than a thinking of it. He doesn't think the facts are thinkings. They're facts that no one has ever thought, but they're thinkables. It's a subset of thinkables, graspables in our vocabulary. It's just the ones that are true. That's the facts. And they're in the realm of sense, not in the realm of reference for him. So they're going to be couched in whatever vocabulary we express our thoughts in. Now, metaphysical objectivists, in effect, do say that there's nature's own vocabulary. David Lewis thinks that there must be some set of properties that are natural properties, and that other ones are gerrymandered versions built out of those by disjunction and other such things. I talked last time about Cambridge properties and Cambridge changes. Here I think one of the underlying thoughts is that if we think about a property as a respective similarity of objects, any two objects are similar to each other in an infinite number of respects and dissimilar to each other in an infinite number of respects. What is it that privileges some of those respects as properties that they genuinely share? And Lewis says there must be something. Those are the natural properties. Everything else is built out of those. And Rorty says that privileging, that's a normative notion. It's saying some of those properties, some of those respects of similarity are better than others. They get at the reality better than the others. And all matters of authority, of normative assessment, are ultimately matters of social practice. The difference between the respects of similarity that we deploy in describing the world and the infinite ones that we don't is just that. Those are the ones we use in describing the world. There isn't any grouping of the objects or division of the infinite respects of similarity and dissimilarity between objects that the world puts its imprimatur on. That's a matter of our social practices. Here's two versions of that pragmatist thought. Quine's colleague at the same time and student of C.I. Lewis and Carnap, Nelson Goodman, in his famous 1954 book, Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, asks, which properties should we project in our inductive inferences? Out of all the respects of similarity, all the ways we could describe the facts that we've observed, induction tells us to expect past regularities to be continued into the future. But there's an infinite number of ways we can describe these regularities. He introduces the notion of GRU. Yes, it's true that all emeralds have been green and all sapphires have been blue, but it's also true that all the emeralds have been GRU, where that's green before the year 3000 and blue after it. What is it that privileges some of these specifications of the regularity as ones we should project? And his answer is the pragmatist one. Well, those are the ones that are sedimented in our practices. Those are the ones that we project. And put that way, we can see the same thought as in play in Wittgenstein's investigations, with his concern about all the different ways we could specify what going on in the same way is, to continue applying an expression in the same way or counting in the same way. There's an infinite number of different vocabularies we could use to describe those practices, those regularities. What is it that privileges some of them rather than others? And Wittgenstein gives the social pragmatist answer to that. It's the role they play in our practices, which answers both to facts about us and to the way the world is, but only in this sort of holistic way. So here's another big fork in the philosophical methodological world, is whether you think nature comes with its own vocabulary in the form of respects of similarity that are fundamental properties, natural properties, distinguished from the ones we can build out of them, gerrymander them in the Cambridge property, Cambridge changes sort of way. So I think these remarks of Rorty asking about whether it really makes sense to talk about nature's own vocabulary, or if not, how we're to think about the significance of specifying the facts. They have to be specified in some vocabulary, and what privileges them being, well, just the practices we use. And I've suggested that this is an extension of the broadly Davidsonian arguments about the vehiclelessness of intentional contents in our states. that holism about content is holism about vocabularies, and that once you've made the move to the vocabulary, it obliges you to be just as holistic about the world you're talking about. That doesn't absolutely rule out a representational reading of our relation to it, but it rules out atomistic versions of that. It rules out the truth maker versions of that. Now, as I say, this argument, it seems to me to be implicitly in play in these various bits of rhetoric that Rorty uses. He never tries to tease it out and sort of do it step by step. And, while I've broken it down a little, I've still mostly been waving my hands at it, but trying to separate out one strand in the thought downstream from the social pragmatism about normativity, which is coming in here because we're privileging some respects of similarity in the world. And then downstream also from the insights incorporated in using the vocabulary. So let me pause there. That argument should look different from the one about the distinction between subjective, intersubjective, and objective things being a social distinction. There's a different line of thought, and we haven't gotten to the anti-authoritarian one yet.
May I ask a question? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, okay. Is the reference to the intentional states being vehicleless, is that considerations supposed to buttress the holism in a way? Is that its intention?
Yeah. I mean, the argument for the vehiclelessness is really an argument from the holism.
Okay.
I think. I mean, in Davidson, I would say it starts with this interpretivism that says where people had thought of me adopting the intentional stance to you and attributing beliefs and desires and meanings to your utterances as how I find out about how it is sort of with you. And Davidson saying, no, that's all there is to mean by, what someone believes or means. And then looking at what we're doing in interpreting and pointing out, well, you have to interpret sort of the whole thing. It's the way these beliefs and desires interact, the meanings of the utterances I produce, and so on. And then claiming, well, so what kind of a thing is it that I'm saying about you when I say you believe that the cathedral is 555 feet tall? Well, I'm saying something about the role that commitment plays in an overall story about you. So I think it's coming from the holism. Okay. James?
I'm trying to reconcile this implicit argument that you've been bringing out with what seems like Rorty's interest in a kind of pluralism. You've mentioned in past sessions that perhaps there's a kind of like merely Carnapian pragmatism that he could be accused of. 'Cause it seems like there's two things that this holist picture rules out. It rules out an atomistic one-to-one correspondence or representationalist picture, but it seems to equally rule out a kind of freedom to simply adopt personal vocabularies, or even to just, or certainly to stipulate new vocabularies. But as we go on into the anti-authoritarianism portion, it seems like Rorty sees there being sections of discourse that are sort of not responsible to like the whole of public discourse that can be indeed private. So I wonder how you see those two fitting together.
Okay, well, good. Here we might look in the passages on the handout at the top of page 2, because I think he's speaking just to this point. I take the anti-representationalist view of thought and language to have been motivated, in James' case, by the realization that the need for choice between competing representations can be replaced by tolerance for a plurality of non-competing descriptions which serve different purposes. So I'm seeing here him as articulating, he's saying, what we're rejecting is the idea that the world can settle the question of which of our describing vocabularies is better, better fits it. And so we've got to pick, and ultimately we're aiming at the one that, nature says is right. This is my vocabulary for a plurality of non-competing descriptions. That he clearly thinks is a lesson of the pragmatist alternative to the representationalism. Now here he isn't saying that we have completely free choice, arbitrium brutum, in talking however we like. There's still the question of how well does a certain vocabulary satisfy the purposes that it acknowledges as setting the standards for assessing moves in that vocabulary, for those internal pressures, internal to the practice, pressures of saying, well, by our justificatory practices within this vocabulary, this is more justified to say than this other. You have more reason to do this than you do to do this other. I think there remains the challenge you were making. Is there any way that doesn't depend on backsliding into merely Carnapian pragmatism for him to carve out a space for purely private vocabularies? The ones that, because they don't engage public projects, but are merely for self-transformation, can he carve out that space? I mean, in the long essay on the vocabularies, I challenge this just on this point, whether he can really carve out a private realm. It was important to him to do so. I mean, that was basically the theme of Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, which in that same retrospective Library of Living Philosophers autobiographical essay, he says was always his favorite of his books. And I think it was because it connected these dry, professional, sort of inside philosophy, anti-representationalist arguments with much more overtly political arguments, more overtly political than the Girona stuff is, because he's identifying the way he distinguishes the private from the public vocabularies with the private-public distinction that's at the center of political liberalism, and using that his way of making that distinction in his friendly rivalry with Habermas in articulating a political liberalism, what Rorty characteristically described his own view as postmodern bourgeois political liberalism. So this remains a real issue, and I think there is some backsliding in it. The particular way I was putting pressure on it in that essay is what remains of the meaning belief distinction, I think, is or the language theory distinction is the norms of the language that we're speaking, in virtue of which what we say means what it means, on the one hand, and the particular uses we make of it. So the particular new thing that I say with it by stringing these words together that no one has ever strung together in that order before. And we can still make that distinction even after we realize that sort of every new thing I say changes the norms a little bit. If it's a really powerful philosophical or poetic saying, it may change it a lot. You know, introduce a new vocabulary. That's what Rorty sees the strong poets as doing. That's at least part of what's going on in the later Heidegger. But at least a little bit, it's shifting those norms. But it's also drawing on them so that it isn't just nonsense or unintelligible what I'm saying. But if that's right, the private using the language to say something new versus participating in the communal practice, those are really two sides of one coin, and we have to understand them together. What the communal practices are that he's seeing in the public sphere, what they're for is for people to say new stuff with them. That is the private things. So I end up thinking that he's drawing that line in a way that he's not entitled to. And in Habermas's engagement with my way of thinking about language, he's very worried about that dimension of holism undercutting precisely presuppositions near and dear to his heart of political liberalism that he's coming at through a communicative theory of action. So he and Rorty, happy to have a sharper distinction than I do, and it's a source of suspicion about this more Hegelian, but I think more pragmatist way of thinking, as far as what the political implications of it are. I think there's another way to avoid being illiberal from this, but that's another story. Okay, I had one more characterization of a strand of thought in Rorty in this period leading up to the anti-authoritarian version of his anti-representationalism arguments that I wanted to mention. And that has to do with him thinking about our needing to make a choice between focusing on truth in thinking about our discursive practices, truth construed in a representationalist way on the one hand, and thinking about justification on the other hand. And his view is it's justification all the way down. justification is what we do. Our discursive practice is a practice at base of making claims and defending them by giving reasons for them, and challenging those claims by giving reasons against them. And in some cases, that process reaches a conclusion and we have a consensus, and in other cases it doesn't. But giving and asking for reasons is what we do, justifying claims. That's the core of our discursive practice. Truth, as he's thinking about it, is the idea of an external objective standard set by the world we're representing or talking about that serves as an ultimate source of assessment of how well we're doing in giving and asking for reasons. It's something outside of us, objective, in the sense of being independent of our practices and practical attitudes and performances, that nonetheless sets a normative standard against which ultimately the adequacy of our practices of giving and asking for reasons should be judged. And that's what he objects to. Here's one more. So let me say how inappropriate it is in the light of that sort of motivation to think of Rorty as an irrationalist. It's sort of all about giving and asking for reasons for him. He doesn't want to do away with that. Indeed, it's the idea that that answers to something outside of giving and asking for reasons. That's what he's objecting to. And he's going to object to that well, in the anti-authoritarian version of this, he wants to say that the Enlightenment was only half true to its own insights, and that its emancipatory message was actually in tension with the representational conceptual means that it used to advance them. Now, I talked about how I think of Peirce as having described a second pragmatist enlightenment by appealing to the sciences of the 19th century rather than the sciences of the 18th century. Rorty wants to invoke this notion in quite a different way. He thinks that the great achievement of the Enlightenment was in its practical philosophy, in its freeing us from the idea that in our reasoning about what we ought to do, that we're ultimately answerable to a non-human authority, to what William Blake called old Nobodaddy, sitting in the sky, determining how it's appropriate for us to behave, serving as the ultimate authority over the correctness and incorrectness of our practical reasonings. And that the still incomplete process of weaning ourselves from the invocation of that objective, non-human, supernatural authority over our normative practical doings. That Rorty is seeing as the great achievement of enlightenment, and there would see himself as merely chiming in with the Kant of what is enlightenment, who describes the Enlightenment as the emancipation of human beings from their long tutelage, their adolescence, when we looked outside of ourselves for guidance in our conduct. And what Rorty seizes on in this last decade of his life, inaugurated in the Girona lectures, is the idea that an objective reality serving as the ultimate source of authority in our theoretical commitments belongs in a box with the idea of God as the lawmaker, serving as the ultimate authority, the ultimate source of norms in our practical doings. So if we look at some of his ringing claims at the beginning, this pragmatism as anti-authoritarianism is the version he published of the first Girona lecture, and I apologize for having to move the syllabus around, but I realized I'd put the original Girona version and this one both on the reading list, and there wasn't sort of any reason for that. But if you look at the passages that I've highlighted here, the pragmatist's anti-representationalist account of belief is, among other things, a protest against the idea that human beings must humble themselves before something non-human, whether the will of God or the intrinsic nature of reality. So he wants to see anti-representationalism as a version of anti-authoritarianism. Now, I think it's interesting that he titles this essay, he opens the preface to the book version of the Girona lectures by saying a better title for this would have been Pragmatism as Anti-Authoritarianism. That's a conception of what he was doing that only came to him sort of at the end, after he'd given all these lectures. And I think his slogan here, anti-representationalism as a version of anti-authoritarianism, that is, seeing himself as putting forward anti-representationalist arguments from an anti-authoritarian standpoint, I think that's what was new. And it's interesting that for the title of this essay, he doesn't talk about anti-representationalism as anti-authoritarianism, but about pragmatism. Okay, that's his constructive version of anti-representationalism, but here he's willing to identify that with pragmatism. So this argument against anti-representationalism, he's saying, that's now what I mean by pragmatism. And that envisaged book version that he got as far as writing the preface for the English, the one that we will actually put out finally years later, he called Pragmatism a View, and starts off with this essay. So at the heart of it is an analogy that as God stands to Enlightenment critiques on the side of practical philosophy and our thinking about the norms governing what we do, so the notion of an objective reality that it's our job to represent stands to the norms governing our theoretical activity, what claims we make, what commitments we make, what reasons we give, and our practices of justifying now not our doings, but our sayings, our believings. So he's saying the reason the Enlightenment was half-hearted, didn't finish its task, was because though it could free itself from old Nobodaddy being the ultimate source of practical norms, it couldn't free itself from the idea of objective reality as the ultimate source of cognitive norms governing our theoretical activity. Now, I remind you, at the bottom of page 2 in the handout, he says, the representationalist tradition in philosophy, which was dominant in these 400 years, hoped that inquiry would put us in touch, if not with the eternal, at least with something which, in Bernard Williams' phrase, is there anyway, something non-perspectival, something which is what it is apart from human needs and interests, and which would impose normative constraints on our theoretical activity. I'm interpolating. Pragmatists do not think inquiry can put us more in touch with non-human reality than we have always been. For the only sense of being in touch they recognize is causal interaction as opposed to accurate representation. So here he's using Kant's overarching distinction between reasons and causes, between the order of justification and the causal order that asks about the matter-of-factual processes that lead to a belief, a mere physiology of the understanding, as he said about Locke. As he did in Mirror, he's using that distinction between reasons and causes and saying, look, we're causally in touch. We can tell causal stories about how we respond empirically to things around us, and that's all fine. And that guarantees that we're not out of touch. We're literally touching the objective world. The question is, what's the normative significance of those causal interactions? How should we construe the constraint that that objective causal environment puts on our discursive practices? How should we construe the normative significance of that? That's what's at issue here. So back on page 1 of the handout, what he's opposing is those who think of truth, or more precisely, reality as it is in itself, the object accurately represented by true sentences, as an authority that we must respect. And that's the objectionable thing, because up in the previous passage, he's with Dewey in thinking the wholehearted pursuit of the democratic ideal requires us to set aside any authority save that of a consensus of our fellow humans. So what he's going to object to is the idea that anything that's outside of our practices of justifying our commitments, of giving and assessing reasons, should be understood as having authority over it. It's all got to be done from the inside. And one last thing, passage in the middle of page 2, the model that we're supposed to aspire to and that he hopes his pragmatist way of thinking will open up for us on the side of truth and reality, is Dewey's story about history as the story of increasing freedom, as a story of how we gradually acquired the ability to find the same spiritual significance in cooperation between mortals that our ancestors had found in their relation to an immortal being. So we're supposed to find the same theoretical humility in our cooperative justificatory practices, reason-giving and assessing practices that the representationalist tradition found in the ideal of accuracy, of fidelity to the way things anyway are. I can see 3 different kinds of consideration in play here in Rorty, and they're not all of equal plausibility in this anti-authoritarian argument. So one is that it's actually not intelligible in the end to acknowledge the authority of anything non-human over our human practices. The notion of authority is the notion of a normative status, and normative statuses are all and only conferred by the role things play in our social practices. So the very idea of something non-human exercising authority from outside our practices, constraining it, is unintelligible. That's one line he sometimes seems to be taking. A second line that I can see in play, different, would concede that that notion made sense, as one might concede in the case of theological grounding of moral norms. Well, that's an intelligible conception. But on this second line, and this is closer to the Kantian line, if we think of the Kant of religion within the bounds of reason alone, that's an intelligible conception, but it's beneath our dignity to acknowledge the authority of something non-human. To achieve our majority is to take responsibility ourselves. It's intelligible that the source of the norms that ultimately govern us should be sought for something outside of us, but we should really look within. Kant stands in awe only of the starry skies above him and the moral law within him. That the moral law has to be articulating what we most deeply are. And can only stem from the acknowledgement of our autonomy, even though it's intelligible there should be an external source, that would be heteronymous. That would be beneath our dignity as the rational beings we are, is the Kantian thought. And Rorty seems to be invoking this. Here. Right, if you look over on page 4 in the passages, in the middle of the page, the second one I marked up, for Nietzsche and Dewey, the idea that reality has an intrinsic nature, which common sense and even science may never know, that our knowledge may be only of appearance, is a relic of the idea that there's something non-human which has authority over us. The idea of a non-human authority and the quest for sublimity are both products of self-abasement. So you should be ashamed of yourself at prostrating yourself intellectually in the face of a reality that you're trying to represent. That's beneath you, beneath your dignity. That strand seems to be in play. As I say, it's hard for me to see that as not supposing at least the intelligibility of that conception. Though maybe he's saying, you're both making a theoretical mistake, it couldn't really be like that, and a practical mistake. Sort of, even if it were like that, we shouldn't acknowledge it. That's a more Nietzschean line. A third version that I think is more in is a more valid expression of his seeing a fundamental tension between thinking about justification and thinking about truth. A more fundamental one that comes out in various places in the lecture is normative, like the second line, but says it's of the essence of our practices of giving and asking for reasons that authority, to be rational authority, can't be dogmatic. It has to be subject to criticism. Our practices of justifying claims essentially involves the possibility of challenging a claim and demanding that the claim be defended by giving reasons for it. And that means that we shouldn't accord authority to anything whose reasons can't be contested. That only something that's an interlocutor, a player in our practices of giving and asking for reasons, can actually have rational authority. Nothing that can't itself give and ask for reasons can exercise rational authority over our practices. That's the critical lesson, that the critical function of reason, assessing reasons, challenging reasons, giving reasons, defending our claims, that's of the essence of our rational discursive practices. And that means nothing exercises authority in the sense of rational authority, reason constitutive authority, whose reasons can't be challenged, that can't be interrogated as to the reasons it can give justifying its picture of things. So insofar as we're to make sense of the notion of the reality we're representing or talking about, exercising authority over our practices of justifying claims, of giving and asking and challenging reasons and assessing reasons, we've got to fund that notion entirely in terms of the kind of authority that we can rationally exercise and understand in terms of our practices of justification. It would be backsliding from what the Enlightenment taught us about authority, that the authority of tradition is rationally binding on us only insofar as we can interrogate it, only insofar as it can come up with reasons vindicating the commitments that we inherit. And everything is up for rational assessment in that sense. So this third line is to talk about rational authority as opposed to causal constraint is to talk about something that in principle can only be exercised by another participant in our justificatory practices. And any notion of truth or reality as constraining us normatively, as setting a standard for assessment of the goodness of our reason-giving practices, has to be fundable from within those reason-giving practices. Now that third strand has some elements of the unintelligible sort of first strand, and some elements of the it's beneath our dignity strand, but I think it's different and has more go to it. I mean, you'll see, I think a lot more needs to be said, and I still have serious reservations about it. That's what you'll read about next time. But let me stop there for responses or comments or questions.
Can I ask a question? Well, I don't know. I'm having trouble formulating this question, so maybe I can ask you to just try to help me understand a contrast I'm thinking of. So you started part of this bit by talking about how there's a certain tension in the Enlightenment conception of freedom, along with the fact that they still hold on to this notion of representation. And that seems right. But I was also thinking at the same time, it seems like it's not that hard to see how these two notions might complement each other insofar as they both have, there's something atomistic about both of them, insofar as representation, but also the Enlightenment conception of freedom. At least if I'm thinking in particular of someone like Locke. And I guess I was wondering, the two things I'm trying to figure out where exactly the disagreement is in the sort of critique Rorty's making, and then someone like Adorno. And I guess, is it just, in one thing, maybe a very simple way of putting it is just Rorty's more optimistic or something like that, but that doesn't seem to get at the heart of what the disagreement might be, if there is a disagreement. So I don't know. Maybe this isn't, yeah. I guess is there a disagreement there about what's wrong with Enlightenment thinking?
So, I think Rorty is thinking, Kant really did distill the essence of the Enlightenment's insight on the practical side with his notion of autonomy. And that we could see that we'd looked outside for the authority over our doings when we should have been looking inside. It was really a feature of our rational agency that was the source of ultimate moral norms, and that we had projected those features of ourselves into the outside world. Again, atomistic, yes, from the individual in Kant's case. And the parallel picture then that Rorty would be putting forward would be saying, and we're doing the same thing, where our finite practices, contingent practices of treating one thing as a good reason and another thing as a bad reason, and the process by which consensus about what we have reason to believe emerges in some cases and doesn't emerge in the other. Really, the only constraint, the only normative constraint on that is internal to that practice, but we projected it outside and said, no, there's an objective norm, accuracy of representation, that overarches and has authority over these reason-giving practices. If we look at the Hegelian version rather than the Kantian version, so the real social practice version, it's going to use, Marx's term is the best, fetishism. Fetishism being mistaking some product of our social practices for something objective and antecedent to them, constraining them. When I first came to Pittsburgh, it was during the inflation at the end of the 70s, and Billy Graham got 70,000 people into Pirate Stadium to pray for lower interest rates. And that's fetishistic. He's looking at something that's the product of our activities and thinking of it as this objective thing that we could pray about. It was a feature of our practices that was being fetishized in the case of Old Nobodaddy, and Rorty wants to see a feature of our reason-giving and justificatory practices fetishized and projected in the same way, in understanding the world as not just causally constraining our practices, but setting via representational relations, a normative standard from the outside, which all of our justificatory practices are answerable to. That's the analogy I see him working with. I'm not sure that was responsive to the.
I think I have to think a bit more about. No, it is helpful, but I have to try and think it through a bit.
Okay. Now, so I want to see this last strand of the anti-authoritarian argument as adding to, as adding to the social pragmatism about normative statuses, the plausible enlightenment idea that normative statuses are instituted by social practices. You could see it as an enlightenment attitude, as an enlightenment idea in social convention theories of political obligation, social contract theories that say instead of the great chain of being that has God at the top and then the kings and the lords, each of them naturally superior, instead of that saying, no, political authority comes ultimately from the attitudes of the people who are governed. That social pragmatism about norms, the new piece of the puzzle that led to the anti-authoritarian version of this, I think, was the normative analysis of representation. The idea that representational relations are essentially normative relations of a kind of authority that the represented thing exercises over the representing, a kind of responsibility the representing has to what counts as represented by it, just insofar as what's represented serves as a standard of normative assessment of the correctness of the representing. And then Rorty saying, but that kind of assessment, the normative assessment, that's something we do. That's something that can only be understood in terms of our practices of treating one thing as a better reason than another, of actually assessing the goodness of reasons, the goodness of justifications. Remember he talked about, last time we read a quote in which he talked about the old pragmatist chestnut, that when you talk about what's being referred to or represented or described, you're doing that in some vocabulary as well. So ultimately, sort of we're specifying both sides of this relationship. And here he's saying, yeah, that's the only way we could understand representational authority is in terms of the practices that we have of assessing it. At the risk of totally muddying this, the waters here, let me mention two linked arguments about that address ways in which people have tried to get an account of something playing the role of truth out of justificatory practices. And one of them is a particularly pure case, a Cambridge student coming out of the Cambridge pragmatist stable. His thesis advisor was Hugh Price's thesis advisor, this guy James White, wrote a brief piece in Analysis called Success Semantics, in which he said, look, by true belief, we just mean a belief that will be successful when you, in the sense of getting you what you want, when you base your actions on that belief. I mean, he had a fancy way of deriving truth conditions from conditions of satisfaction of desires when you combine all these things. In its way, a pure pragmatist effort. But the root idea was, look, if your plan of action is based on false beliefs, it's mostly going to fail. If it's based on true beliefs, it's mostly going to succeed. And the trouble with this, as I saw it in a 3-page analysis piece called Unsuccessful Semantics, was he wasn't thinking holistically enough that the most you could argue was if all your beliefs were true, then you were more likely to have successful practical reasoning based on it. Because if even one of your collateral beliefs is false, that can mess up the effect of the true beliefs. So I can truly believe that there's cookies in the cupboard, but if I falsely believe that the cupboard isn't mined, it's not going to help me getting cookies out of it. And that in fact, ignorance is as bad as false beliefs. My false beliefs can lead me practically astray if there's important things that I'm ignorant of too. A fancier version of this argument comes up with Crispin Wright's definition of truth or introduction of a successor conception to truth. Wright is I would say, Demetian pragmatist. They don't use, he and his teacher Dummett don't use the term pragmatism, but I think they qualify. He says, instead of talking about truth in these objective representationalist sorts of ways, we should use a notion of super-assertability. So assertability is something's assertable if it's the best justified claim we've got of the competitors. It satisfies our standards. The reasons for it are better than the reasons against it. It's justified. And to say something super assertable is to say that it's assertable, it's justified according to our current lights, and that status of being assertable, of being justified, is robust under arbitrary improvements of our information. So no matter what else we find out about how things are, it isn't going to change the justificatory status of this claim. So this is avowedly his attempt to work out a more precise version of Peirce's "the truth is what inquiry will settle on in the limit." And the trouble with this is, I think, it's either blatantly circular or just incorrect. Incorrect in the sense that things that are super assertable in that sense won't play the truth role well enough. The thing is, when we ask, well, what changes in our belief is it that the super assertable is robust under? It can't be that it's just robust under any change of our belief, because if I acquire a bunch of false beliefs, that might well change the justificatory status of some claim that we want to say pre-systematically is true. If I get convinced that something is a good measuring device for this quantity that isn't at all a good measuring device for it, then that might lead me to give up all of my true beliefs about what has the property. So for it to be plausible at all, when we talk about arbitrary improvements in my information, that has to mean arbitrary addition of true claims, not false ones that will lead me astray. But we're trying to get a characterization of what those are. So that's going to be circular if we have to restrict it to those. And on the other hand, if we can't put that restriction in, maybe there is something that's robust under arbitrary additional commitments, but why should we be interested in that? That's not truth-like enough. Well, those are reasons to think that you're not going to get something truth-like. A notion that's fundable, it's definable in terms of justificatory practices. And that's, of course, the conclusion that Rorty is coming to. Okay, well, in the stuff we read for next week, I'm going to give you sort of my assessment of this argument, and I'll articulate the view that we'll then take into the expressivist segment of our investigation of anti-representationalism, which is by and large conducted downstream from this one. Suffice it to say, one of the things you'll find interesting is that Price accepts more of Rorty's arguments than I do, though we have a core that we both accept and are sort of fighting about where we should be. Before closing this session, though, I want to say something about the remarkable preface that Rorty wrote that's never been published, that I included for the things we could read. It's short. It's a case study in redescription, in Rorty's sense of using a new vocabulary to sort of make things new. What he's redescribing is the history of philosophy, and he uses the vocabulary originally due to Kant, but I don't know, given, inherited by the tradition, mostly from Edmund Burke. And this is the distinction between the beautiful and the sublime. And here, if we look at page 3, in the quotes, the unpublished preface to Pragmatism of View. So here he's characterizing these Girona lectures. It's an attempt to envisage what philosophy would be like if our culture became secularized through and through, in the sense that the idea of obedience to a non-human authority were to disappear completely. Now, this is actually a somewhat different description of his motivation. He's not saying, look, I'm going to give you an argument why we should secularize completely. The task for pragmatism is to see how you might do that. What would the world look like if we gave up the idea of obedience to a non-human authority, which I'm suggesting we understand as one whose reasons cannot be queried, cannot be challenged, cannot have reasons demanded of it and found wanting in our practices. And so here's the operative distinction. The sublime is unrepresentable, undescribable, ineffable, whereas the beautiful harmonizes finite things with other finite things. The sublime escapes finitude and therefore both unity and plurality. And now Plato's idea of the good is of something sublimely admirable, and the Christian idea of sin is of something sublimely evil. So we've seen his criticisms of the Platonist tradition following Dewey. He's adding to this Dewey's complaint about, anyway, one strand in Christianity, and he wants to assimilate these now under the image of organizing your life around admiration of the sublime rather than the beautiful. Quote at the bottom of that page, the epistemological subjectivist twist that Descartes gave philosophy produced a new version of the sublime. This was the infinite, abyssal, unbridgeable gap between our pragmatic minds or jerry-built languages and reality as it is in itself. So the trouble is going to be, he's saying, that instead of settling for an ideal of the merely beautiful, something we can fund in terms of our rough and ready practices of giving and asking for reasons, we are hypnotized by an ideal that has the structure of the sublime. That's what, that's the vocabulary he's going to use to organize his opposition. I'll mention the sort of thing that leads Burke to think this is an important distinction. This is a small example, but I think a telling one, that there was a striking change in the practices of people who took carriages through the Alps that started in the late 1700s. Before that, it was absolutely critical that the window shades be rolled up so that you wouldn't see the horrific, terrifying chasms between the mountains, the cliffs, the peaks, and so on. That was just a terrifying, sublime vision of the non-human, and nobody wanted to look at that. You just wanted not to think about it. Then you got a generation of painters who made it literally picturesque, the kind of thing you would want to look at pictures of. And now people would take carriages into the Alps specifically to look out the windows of the carriages. What had been sublime and terrifying got domesticated into the merely beautiful. Well, you can think something was lost. Rorty's saying, yes, 2 cheers for modernity. That was a good thing that was happening there. Now, I said this was a case study. Rorty's playing an intellectual's game here. Wittgenstein, well, he says this, the Tractatus, that's got the sublime. Of that of which one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. There's an image of the sublime there. The later Wittgenstein, a philosopher of the beautiful. Come back to our practices of assessing. Although for his purposes, he needs to put Plato and Aristotle in the sublime bucket, I think it makes much more sense, if you're going to see Plato as the philosopher of the sublime, to see Aristotle as the philosopher of the beautiful. But we can continue this. The reason Heidegger repudiates being in time is it's a merely anthropological work. It doesn't look beyond our practices. Merely beautiful, not the sublimity of the contemplation of being that you get in the later work. I'm prepared to argue that in these terms, Frege's Begriffsschrift and Grundgesetze are beautiful, but the Grundlagen and the thought are sublime. Sartre, being in nothingness, beautiful. Saint-Genet, sublime. Well, is there a point to this sort of game? Has something gone wrong here? Gombrich's Art and Illusion, his 1950s lectures, which are immensely influential in the history of art, are cited on this point by Nelson Goodman, the Harvard pragmatist, in Languages of Art. Gombrich is worried about genres in art, and particularly the notion that was abroad in the tradition he inherited, that we had since the Renaissance gotten much better at painting realistic paintings. And so he's thinking about this assessment of paintings as more or less realistic, which it's the job of those lectures to demolish. But he cites this psychological research that says if you take 2 nonsense terms like ping and pong and give people instances, paradigms of application of them, if you say, well, as a poet, Milton was ping, but William Blake was pong, and Spencer was ping, but Wordsworth was pong. If you give people half a dozen paradigms of applications of the nonsense syllables like that, they will, to a remarkable degree, agree about how to apply the terms to novel cases. Now, when you ask them, well, of Eliot and Pound, who would you say was ping and who was pong? You'll get a lot of agreement about that. Now, Gombrich took this to mean that we can kid ourselves that we're applying a concept when they're just these nonsense things. Okay, ping and pong, beautiful and sublime. Yeah, we can go on. We can say, Miles Davis, a jazz player with the structure of the beautiful Charlie Parker Sublime. Go on in this way. But Goodman thinks that's not the conclusion that a pragmatist should draw from the research that Gombrich was talking about. It's rather that this is how concepts work. They're all ping and pong at base. We can give them some content by inferentially linking them to other concepts, but it comes down to being able to go on in the same way and applying these concepts in new cases. And if we can do that with ping and pong, that's the way you shape an actual concept. And that's what I see Rorty is doing here with the concepts beautiful and sublime, thinking about the structure of a philosophical sensibility as to whether you are a philosopher of the beautiful or a philosopher of the sublime. He's taking these terms that he gives us a little bit of a hint about at the beginning, and maybe we've read Kant on this, maybe we've read Burke on it, but he's using this to teach us to go on in the same way as talking about philosophers now, ways philosophers can be. And to a large extent in Rorty's later work, this is what he does. He will pick some distinction or set of concepts drawn from anywhere in his broad readings in the culture and will use it to tell a story about the history of philosophy, or sometimes the history of the whole culture, depending on how he's thinking about the audience that he's addressing. This is, I think, a paradigm. He does this in 8 pages, I think, in this preface. It's a paradigm of redescription, using a new vocabulary to make us aware of different things than we're aware of using the old vocabularies. So since this is so short, I urge that you reread it. Yeah. Okay, so for next time, there are these two, this is the only time I'm going to make you sort of just read my stuff, but it's because it's the last week on Rorty, and you can look at the foreword that I wrote for these Girona lectures. I'll talk some more about the occasion of the Girona lectures and all that I'm addressing next time. But these 2 lectures are supposed to be my Spinoza lectures at the University of Amsterdam in the spring. We'll see whether that happens in real life or not. And then as Oxford Press publishes the Oxford Locke lectures, their sort of continental version is they publish the Spinoza lectures as a book as well. The core of the Price reading that we're going to do was his Descartes lectures from Amsterdam, which were published by the Cambridge Press rather than the Oxford Press. But these things are to be the core of a book about Rorty that I'm planning to write for Oxford, built around these lectures. So that's for next time. Okay, and I mentioned this at the beginning, but let me remind you, apparently the beginning of the Zoom is going to look different next time because everybody will be in a waiting room. So don't panic. I'll eventually figure out how to get you out of the waiting room and into the real thing. What I'm mostly worried about is if anyone comes in late, it's supposed to notify me that somebody's stuck in the waiting room, but will it, and will I notice it, and will I be able to do it? I am confess that I'm nervous about this, but we shall see, but don't be daunted. We'll figure it out. Okay. I'll stop the recording, but I'll stick around in case anybody wants to talk about things. Okay, see you next week.